Chief Secretary, distinguished guests, and friends and colleagues. It's a great honor to be with you here today. And I really do have to also echo Carrie's thanks to the British Council, the Efficiency Unit, the Jockey Club Make a Difference initiative, and to the many others who've been able to make today happen. I also need to pay special tribute to Carrie, who over last year has really, in many ways, changed my perception of Hong Kong. Hong Kong has many strengths, as we know, and is admired around the world as a place of great wealth and an economic engine. Over the years, I've come back many times because my parents are from Hong Kong, and my wife is as well. But really, it was only this last year, as I spoke with Carrie on our many encounters, and I got a sense of the real desire and an interest in finding creative new solutions to social problems, perhaps brought about by some of the recent challenges that have built up over a number of years, that I have felt a reawakening, if you like, of my own sort of Hong Kong background and a desire perhaps to come along and contribute. So I'm here today with some of my colleagues really to learn and also to share, and hopefully together we can come up with some understandings that will be able to help bring forward both the UK and Hong Kong in our work. Sun Yat-sen, on that note, who's a great hero of mine, in fact, his village is very close to where my grandfather's village is in Zhongshan. He once said that to understand is hard, but once one understands, action is easy. And I do hope that our exchange today will bring about a deeper understanding and then action, which we can then implement both here in Hong Kong, but also as well in the UK. And Hong Kong, of course, as you know, is a perfect place to bring about this kind of understanding and also to bring forward action as a pivot between East and West, something that I'll talk about a little bit later on. Now, for those who don't know me, or as well as those who do know me, I'll ask your indulgence as I share a little bit of my own background as part of this presentation, which I think, as you hear my personal story, you'll come to some understanding as to sort of how we developed the thinking in the Shaftesbury Partnership and subsequently in government. I'm then going to very quickly go over the historical context in the UK and in many different countries around social reform and social innovation, which will be a bit of a whistle-stop tour. And then I'm going to close with some reflections on the learnings so far, some of which will get quite theoretical, and hopefully it'll become apparent why, having been a practitioner of social enterprise my whole life, I'm getting quite theoretical. But I also will leave Patrick and Jeff, who are here with me today, to fill in some of the detail from the concepts and give you many case studies and experiences to anchor the theory in sort of practice. So let me just quickly go over some of the past 10 years, really, in my own experience on this journey. I by no means intended to get involved in social work or social enterprise. In fact, I by no means intended to go into politics either. So clearly, when you decide not to do something, be careful, because 10 years later you may find yourself being drawn in to do the very thing that you didn't want to do. My career was very much headed towards business. Very much the overseas Chinese experience. You work hard, you study, you go to somewhere like Oxford, you join a big company like McKinsey, and I spent 3 years there doing technology, doing investment, and also started to kind of understand a bit more through some projects McKinsey did on social enterprise, which in about 12, 13 years ago was still quite a new field in the UK. And so my path was set. I would go off and hopefully make some money and you know, settle down, have a family, have kids, and that'll be that. And to be honest, even my first foray into social enterprise, into education, was also a bit of an accident. I cannot claim to have had this kind of, at the time, huge awakening. You know, most people, particularly the wealthy who become social reformers or social innovators, there's a couple things that happen to them. Either they get sick, So Sweden Lewis, who was the son of John Lewis, who invented the John Lewis model, he spent a year in hospital after a horse riding accident. And it made him think, why do the employees have 1% or less of the wealth of this business, and my family has 99%? And then that's what led him to create that model. So they either get sick, or there's some other trauma in their life or some other experience that makes them sort of enter the world of philanthropy or whatever. None of that happened to me. I was very healthy, and I didn't have any particular massive change of values. I mean, I grew up as a Christian, but was working in a professional field. But then a couple things that happened to me. One is that McKinsey were very kind. They enjoyed working with me. They liked me being around, I guess, and said, you can stay. You can either stay on and become a partner, or go to business school, go to Stanford, or, and this is the key bit, do whatever you like, and then come back after 2 or 3 years, perhaps via business school or direct. So it was an amazing offer. And then the second thing that happened to me is that as a young man, I reflected on technology, which is the field that I was interested in. This was just as the dot-com era was booming and bursting. And I thought as a young man, well, you already have Steve Jobs and you already have Bill Gates, and they've already kind of defined the territory. I didn't know that Mark Zuckerberg would come along later on. But in a way, the thinking and the doing, a lot of it had been done already. It felt like a lot of the rest was going to be filling in the details. And as a young, ambitious man, I thought, well, how else can you shape a new area? And actually, the social enterprise area seemed really interesting, an area where you could do a lot of new thinking and create a lot of new industries even, or markets or opportunities. So that felt very attractive to me. So I embarked then and sort of turned away some of the other opportunities I had in investment, and started on a path together with a fellow colleague of mine called Brett Wigdorts, who was the founder of a charity called Teach First. And for those of you who don't know it, Teach First tries to get the best top graduates. We borrowed the thinking from McKinsey and the civil service, and try to entice them to teach for 2 years, at least, in difficult inner-city schools, initially in London and then across the UK. And then eventually, I just found out recently that now they're in about 22 countries, I think, including in China. Teach for China has been piloting for 2 years now. And the key thing about Teach First is we try to apply all of our business expertise and all of our knowledge from technology investing, creating startups, the kind of same ideas that create Facebook, we applied to this social problem and into the social solution. And the idea was to create something that could scale very fast, because the problem was huge. In the UK 10, 12 years ago, in some schools, you would have 6 different teachers in 2 years. And many teachers were temporary, because the recruitment challenge was very difficult. And so through Teach First, which I will go into a bit more detail in a minute when I to use it as a case study, I experienced huge growth personally, as well as seeing that organization go from a handful of us in a room in the first year to becoming a national organization by the 3rd year. And I came away from that experience really inspired and really sort of challenged to think, well, I love that experience, that sort of, that idea that you can take what it feels like to be in a dot-com, in a startup, but also in a social context, and see the impact of what you're doing with the children, and also the changed lives of the teachers, many of whom then went on into teaching, and now we have head teachers in the UK who've done Teach First. And then others who went into business, into McKinsey or Goldman or the civil service, carried that experience of poverty with them. That was the key thing, actually, above everything else, not the fact that they were teachers and now we have head teachers, but actually you have these people who never would have seen poverty firsthand, who experienced it as a teacher, and then feel determined for the rest of their life to do something about it. So then I started to explore, how else can I get this kick? Again, I think you can hear that, I was still not being that philanthropic. I was still not thinking, how can I help the poor? It was, how can I make an impact? How can I make a difference? And have that kind of experience again. It's all actually quite selfish in a way. And then I discovered the Victorian Reformers. My church leader gave me a book about the poor man's Earl, it's called, about this person called the Lord Shaftesbury, who nobody really remembers in the UK, to be honest. He has a statue if you ever go to Piccadilly Circus, there's a statue called, they call it the Statue of Eros, And everybody thinks it's Cupid and it's about love and, it's romantic and you take pictures. But actually the statue was erected in memory of Lord Shaftesbury. And in his day, he was, a really respected figure among the rich and the poor. And he was amazing. Carrie touched upon what he did. But for example, he not only reduced factory hours for children, which was a huge fight in its day, but he helped to abolish chimney sweeping. We talk about pollution here in China. Chimney sweeping was killing children by the age of 11, 12. And so he abolished that. But then you have a problem. You create all these children who are running around the streets stealing and begging. So he helped to invent shoe shining. And the entire social enterprises, called the black coats or something like that, and got these kids to have a trade for themselves. And eventually they also created ships which would train young people in new trades, plumbing and carpentry, and then they'd go off to Australia and to the New World and be able to start a new life for themselves. In fact, one of the ships I discovered last month is still around, and there's a museum in New York, and you can see the ship called the Artesia, where they trained these kids. And there are many things he did. But in his lifetime, there are about 60 different initiatives, many of which scaled and went around the world. So I was very inspired by that and felt then, back in 2006, that's what I'm going to do. So I went back to McKinsey and said, sorry, I'm not coming back. I'm going to somehow find a way to apply the inspiration of Shaftesbury and those reformers, combined with the knowledge that we have now from technology about how you create scalable initiatives, and then also from business about how you create effective ideas. But I'm not going to be able to do it alone. I'm going to have to work with the professionals and the practitioners in different fields, in health, in ex-offending with prisons, in unemployment, combining all of these bits of knowledge together. And that's really been the story of the last 7 years. We set up the Shaftesbury Partnership, which I did part-time, and then also worked portfolio with a foundation, also starting new programs and initiatives. And after a few years, probably about 10 to 12 initiatives have been started, many of which have scaled, and I'll let Patrick in particular talk about those initiatives. I then was able to work closely with David Cameron, the now Prime Minister in the UK, who was very keen, as many actually politicians and government leaders now are, about how you harness this amazing energy. Imagine if you could harness the kind of energy that's created Facebook and Google, but apply that to social problems. I think that's what many world leaders are interested in. And so we developed together this concept of the big society, which really describes the end goal. How you get to that end goal, it became more and more apparent to me as I've been involved in that work, comes down to what I've always been committed to, which is how you create these kind of social ventures that can scale and ultimately release the resources and the power and the ideas and enable citizens to get involved with helping to change and improve society and feel more connected with the solutions that are there. So this was really a journey that I think I've been called a veteran. I don't quite yet feel a veteran as still a very young man, but certainly I felt like I've had many lifetimes of experience, many difficult times and many great times as well, embarking on this path. And I guess the question that now comes is, having done that a lot in the UK, why am I here in Hong Kong? There's obviously the personal reason. I do feel a real, and felt on my last few visits, again, how much I feel a connection because of my heritage and my upbringing, and seeing the social problems here. In fact, we visited just the other day. We've had a few days here to kind of immerse ourselves, some very poor areas and some poor families, and seeing firsthand some of the challenges that are here, even in this very wealthy city. I do feel a sense of responsibility. And the more you do this work over the last 6-7 years, as I've been engaged in helping to tackle some of these challenges, the more you do feel that you're doing something that's really worthwhile, and that passion develops. But it's not automatic. And with our young people, thankfully, with many of our young people, the millennials in Europe, in Hong Kong, they have an innate sense of social responsibility. Perhaps it's Facebook again. That social connection. But more importantly, I think there's a historic role, just to lift our eyes a little bit, that we here in Hong Kong and in Asia, in China, that we have. The reason why I've reflected the last year, the reason why the Victorian reformers were able to do what they do is because Britain, in that era, was the rising economic power in the world. And it had just gone through an industrial revolution, which had resulted in huge inequality. I mean, you only have to read Dickens to hear about the kind of inequality between the Victorian tycoons and the kind of very poor orphans and slum families. Huge inequality, huge environmental problems. Even up to the 1960s, I keep reminding my colleagues in Parliament, if you walked around in London some days, the smog would be so bad that people would regularly fall down holes in the street and die because they couldn't see the holes in the ground, the manholes. So pollution was a huge issue in that society. And of course, there was a lot of illiteracy, a lot of alcoholism, a lot of, and you had slavery as well. And we think we've got rid of slavery, but actually, some would argue that it still exists today, both in some of our factories around the world, and also economic, too. If you have a mortgage that it will take you 100 years to pay off, it feels a bit like slavery, I think, sometimes, right? So, lots of challenges, and that led to civil society in Britain deciding they needed to do something. Why did they need to do something? Because they looked at Europe and saw the French Revolution 100 years before, and they realized if they didn't do something, something bad would happen. And I go to China a lot, and I meet with many, very wealthy Chinese, and particularly in the mainland, and they're worried. They're worried, and in a way, that worry is not a bad thing, because if that worry can be turned into philanthropy, social action, social reform, and we can work with them and with our wealthy here, we can do something perhaps on a similar level to what the Victorians did. And of course, if you're at the center of the economic engine in the world as it rises, the ideas that you develop here, the innovation you develop here, can spread to the world, to Africa, to South America, to all the other emerging parts of the world too. So the stakes are high. I think never believe that what you're doing in Hong Kong is just for Hong Kong. Of course, it's a unique environment. But what you do here could grow and develop and could benefit other countries too, including the UK, including Britain. Very much a Chinese model, a Chinese path, a Hong Kong path, but also with the ability to leapfrog over some of the solutions that we've seen in the West. So I would counsel those in government, don't just assume what we do in Britain is the right way. Actually, in many ways, it's often the most expensive way, and it worked for a time. Maybe we can jump over that. Just as many in different countries now, they don't even bother with the fixed telephone lines. They just go straight to mobile. Can you imagine mobile public services, not fixed line public services? How can you develop that kind of innovation? Libraries, for example. I was just talking to Ada about libraries. In the era of Kindle, do some countries need physical libraries that just give out physical books? Maybe they can just jump to digital, and to physical but digital books. And libraries are used instead to discover what it is like to write, to read, and to learn. So that's just some example. So just really quickly, I'm going to cover, hopefully in only about 4 or 5 minutes, the history of social reform in the world, and ambitiously. And this may be a very familiar slide to you, but if you look at society generally, you tend to have about, a very high level, 4 sectors. You have the government sector, the business sector, the social sector, the NGOs and that, and the citizen sector, which is sort of citizens acting together, not with any particular legal organization, but in a kind of fairly spontaneous, sometimes, way. And what you find is if you go right back to the very beginning, obviously we start with the citizen, just individuals in a village, or concerned with their lives. Maybe then they start farming, and then you have a kind of early kind of agricultural business sector. Then they start to realize that they have some social problems they need to deal with, so they develop, set aside people to care for the elderly, perhaps the grandparents look after the children, perhaps they start to do some kind of early form of education. And then over time, there are various disputes that they have to resolve, or the initiatives started by the grandparents, perhaps through some kind of natural disaster, like a flood or, a war. They require government to provide defense and so forth. This is very, basic. But then you find it repeats itself. So then suddenly the governments start to get too strong, or they monopolize the resources. So then the villagers start once again, say, well, we need to take control. So then they, either have a coup or whatever, or organize themselves. And then as we come to the recent centuries, we see a similar trend happening. That, in the Victorian era, you saw the rise of the industrialists, the business sector, who became really, really strong. Some of what they did created huge social problems, as I described, in sort of the 19th century. So then there was an evolution of the social sector. I often say, in Britain at least, much of the 20th century was about formalizing the innovations from the 19th century. All of our schooling, all of our health, all of our social work, all of our housing policy, everything came from innovators in that era who created new forms of social innovation that became, at scale, things that then the government adopted. And of course, in the 20th century, you had war. We had the real wars, we had the Cold Wars, a time of emergency. So again, the government came in and nationalized many things. And then after the war, as I think that was experienced too here as well in Hong Kong, there was a real emergency need to feed the poor, to eradicate disease. We created the welfare state, right? And then again, in the UK, Thatcher came along and said, there is this thing called the business sector as well. We can't just have, mining and everything just run by the government. So then we had privatization, and then that worked to a certain degree, but then we had recession. And then Tony Blair came along and said, actually, don't forget, there is something called the social sector. He called it the third way, the third sector. And therefore, we had this social enterprise movement and the last sort of 15 years or so. And then recently, with, again, a big emergency, we've had the government come in, often to deal with financial crises or other crises. And the government has, in the UK, and I think here as well, really gotten behind the social sector and given out a lot of money, a lot of resources. But there's a challenge to that, because let's go back to the original village. It was really nice when I, as a grandparent, could help my grandchildren, when I could help my neighbor. There was a connection there. There was a sense of community there. The danger if government, particularly large government structures, and large, even NGOs or large businesses get involved in delivery, you feel a distancing from the people you're trying to help and the people who are doing the helping. And if you're not careful, that can separate out people. And so sometimes people feel disconnected. And again, please don't get me wrong, I'm not trying to blame or criticize either government or the social sector. I'm just talking about how, if things get taken to a natural point of size and professionalism, that you get that distancing. So in recent years, we've seen movements like Occupy, at the extreme end, or community organizing. Obama basically partly was elected through civil movements. And a return, and social media is fueling it, a return to people saying, I want to do this, I want to farm. I don't want to leave farming to industrial farmers. I want to create music. I don't want to just have, EMI decide what music I listen to. I want to, choose my own playlist, etc. I want to have some control over my children's schooling, how my neighborhood is designed, how I can learn about health, how I give birth. Suddenly you have this proliferation of desire of people to get more involved in what's going on around them. And the internet spoils us because it gives us so much choice and opportunity and control. And I think government in times like this finds it difficult because you're facing this huge spider or this huge octopus of demand and need and interest, but it doesn't always fit the way you're designed to engage with the public. So this has been sort of the whistle-stop tour. And of course, I could go into even more detail around the interface between government and social and business and government. You have within that CSR, you have social enterprise, you have social business, you have tendering and commissioning. But I think the basic thing I want to leave you with, as I move on from here, is to say that now more than ever, the problems that we face in society are incredibly complex. Really, really complicated. Not only are they global in nature, but they are no longer treatable in a single event or activity. Eradicating polio, you can do. Dealing with obesity is much more difficult. Dealing with poor literacy, you can deal with. Dealing with low educational aspiration is much more complex. And in many ways, no one single sector can deal with each of the social problems we now face. Look at environmental problems. It requires a partnership between government, business, and social, and the citizen, we the consumer. You know, we are the most people, we are responsible ultimately for alcoholism, for obesity, for, education, as parents, as citizens, as children, as young people. And so the question is, how do you then tackle these social problems, which are cross-geographical, cross-sector, and chronic in nature, in time of global austerity and of high technology and wealth inequality? The normal methods are still important and they are still needed, but we need new and innovative ways of understanding complexity and dealing with it. And one way, which we have been pioneering, and I know is happening in Hong Kong, is to use social ventures, social venturing. Now, I'd like to use the word social ventures. I don't tend to use the word social enterprise as a catch-all anymore, because social enterprise, certainly in the UK, has become a contested word. Some actually view it as a legal definition of an organization where half of the assets are, separated, and the other half can be investors or so on. And also, which bit is enterprise and which bit is social? In many ways, I don't care. As long as it's something that wants to tackle a complex social problem, and it can broadly be defined as a venture, there's an organization behind it, I'm happy to work with it. It could be more on the business end, it could be actually a business. And many of our tech businesses now in the UK are social ventures, but they're indistinguishable from Google. Or it could be a charity, but where the trustees and that charity wants to work in a very entrepreneurial way to tackle complex challenges at a systemic level as well as a local level. And through social venturing, we want to produce the kind of innovation that permeates government, business, social, and harnesses the citizen to address some of these very difficult challenges. So, social venturing is very important, but I also want to distinguish it a little bit from social innovation. I have many colleagues in the UK who do social innovation. The one key difference between social innovation and social venturing, in my view, is scale. Social innovation, you can have 1,000, 1,000,000 ideas, and many of them are really, really good. But if you really want to change and impact a social problem, which tends to be big and tends to be prevalent throughout society and the world, it needs to scale. So the difference between social innovation and social venturing is, and actually what we have done the last few years, I can't say has always been that socially innovative. Often we've borrowed ideas from America, like Teach First, which was Teach for America. I look forward one day to borrowing ideas from Hong Kong and from China. But if it's a social venture, then it means it's built to scale, just like a startup business is often built to scale. And another way we can understand social venturing is that in many ways, what we're trying to create are viruses, or rather antiviruses, okay? If you look at the complex social problems we face, they are like a kind of disease that has infected society across business, across government, across all these different sectors, and they're complicated. Treating this disease is not easy. You can't just chop off a hand. And in extreme cases, you can amputate, obviously, but that's not really the ideal solution. You can also pump a lot of blood. You can keep the patient in hospital for a long time, but that doesn't cure the illness. The illness is deep inside that body. And so therefore, you need to create something that starts initially very small, inject it into the system, and within the makeup of that virus or that antivirus is all the ingredients that you need as it grows within the body to transform the body, to heal the illness, and to restore it to health. And what you're trying to do is change social DNA, the way people think, the way organizations think, the way the organizations operate, and the way they work together. One thing I learned many years ago was that our DNA in our body, 70%, or about 70% of our DNA is actually viruses that infected us before. And eventually our body adapted and absorbed that virus into the DNA, and it became part of the body. If you think about it, 20th century government is like that kind of DNA. 70% of everything we do in government today used to be social ventures that was created hundreds of years ago and then got spread around the world through different government structures. So our hospitals, our education, everything. Some innovator started that. One day, it was just 2 people in a room or 1 person in a room, and then it scaled, became mainstream, was adopted, and became the solution for that social problem across all the different sectors. So really, what we're trying to do in social venturing, we're trying to do a kind of virology. We're like clinicians. right? That's one way to think about it, at the systemic level. I'm not saying at the front line. At the front line we're GPs, we're doctors, we're nurses, caring for the patient. But at the highest level, in a laboratory, we're like clinicians. And what we're trying to do is create these viruses, these antiviruses. And of course, we need to get better and better at doing that because these viruses, the diseases that we're fighting have become resistant to the traditional medicine that we apply. We apply legislation, normally, and we apply money. Those are the two historic. This is the antibiotics that we've used in the 20th century, legislation and money. And the patient and the disease are now resistant to money, and they're resistant to legislation, right? Shaftesbury could change laws and stop factories from abusing, workers. You can legislate to stop factories from abusing workers, but in many countries, they don't listen to the law, or they try and get around the law, right? Or in the UK, we have so many laws that our judges are still processing laws from 5 or 10 years ago. And I won't talk about money because, as you know, money can help, but it can also create bubbles. So we look at some of the challenges I've been hearing about in Hong Kong: youth unemployment, housing, immigration. These are complex systems. You can create laws and you can put money in, but they're also somewhat resistant sometimes to that because of the different interests that are involved and the interlinkage. Even government, in many ways, often is the cause of some of those problems because of the way government receives tax or has to work with business or other stakeholders to promote growth. Not easy to solve them. So you need a deliberate multidisciplinary, multi-stakeholder process to scale solutions that have been shown to work. And I'm going to leave Patrick in a minute to talk about the experience of developing those antiviruses in the UK. Question is now, as a policymaker, as a business leader, as a leader in the voluntary sector, and as a citizen, how do we support this antivirus activity? Something that can happen both inside our organizations and our sectors, as well as something that can happen outside, but endorsed and supported by it. It's difficult to develop these initiatives always just from within government. I know. You have intense media scrutiny. I know how Carrie feels, at times. Intense pressure from the voters, the citizens, a lot of politics. It's like trying to give birth to a baby in a train station. Very, very difficult. What you need is for the baby to be given birth to somewhere safe and to be risen up. All these films where the hero is exiled and maybe is killed, and then their son or daughter is raised somewhere in the countryside and finally gets strong and then finally comes back in and becomes the new king, right? You need that kind of process, because if you leave that baby in the imperial palace, who knows what will happen to them, right? So that's the kind of process we're trying to cultivate. And we tried to do that. We have tried to do that in the UK, but it's not always easy. So we now need to think about how do we do this in a much more systemic and robust way, and in a way that's repeatable. When people develop viruses, antiviruses, they follow a process. They can repeat that process. The hit rate is pretty good. They're not randomly shooting off different ideas. You can do that, but it will take you a long time to develop the antivirus. Teach First is an example of this. We designed Teach First to launch big. It started with $1 million seed capital. It involved business, the voluntary and government sector. It had a sustainable model, and it was therefore able to grow very quickly. The key thing that we learned through that is that the key thing you need to understand in developing venturing is understanding risk and human behavior. Many people think Teach First as a model is just, you can replicate it by taking anything that has a 2-year program that targets top graduates. That's Teach First. No, that's not what Teach First is really about. The issue with Teach First is it was very risky for a top graduate to go and work in a tough school in the UK. It was career death. You'll be doing it for 30 years and it might not work. So we had to design a program that tackled all of the risks that those teachers felt. We involved business so that afterwards they didn't feel that they had to, just become a teacher. If they wanted to, that's great, but they could have another way out and they could do other things. But also, so we tried to make it prestigious to deal with that risk. But also the children, if you think about it, in the schools, they have lots of risks too. If they perform in some of these schools, their fellow pupils and their parents even will say, what are you doing? If you become smart and you go to university, you'll leave us. You won't be here to help us. there's a risk to them that they get alienated by their own community. And there's a risk of failure. There's nothing worse. What's worse than failure? Having tried and then failed, right? So what the first teachers were trained to do was to work with these pupils and say, no, you can do it, and I'm going to be here with you every step of the way, and we're going to get you to Oxford or wherever it is, and and we're going to work with your parents to make sure they buy in as well, right? And then the third thing that we also did is some of these teachers are the elite. They're the sons and daughters of the tycoons. Tony Blair's son has done it. President Clinton's daughter has done Teach for America. And for them, often, being around poor people was risky. They're protected from it for the whole of their life. They didn't know how to deal with it. Suddenly, you put them in an environment where they understand more. They have friends who work among people with low incomes. And suddenly, they feel more confident that they, in their position, can do something, not just give money in a dispassionate way, but actually get involved, policy, through their businesses on the ground. So we're tackling risk in multiple ways. And if you think about it, at the end of the day, what we do in government and what we try and do in business, and what we do, I think, in the voluntary sector, is we try and create insurance for citizens to help reduce the risk in their lives. And if we can find ways to improve the chance of them doing something good instead of something bad, to nudge them towards positive behaviors, then suddenly we're starting to affect the behavior of the body and changing the way that the disease operates until it gets incorporated, until the disease actually serves the needs of society, the community. There are many examples I can give, but I know that time is getting on. But housing, I know, is a controversial area in Hong Kong, and you can create all kinds of financial and legal means. But I wonder if you really analyzed it, some of the issues are to do with risk. It's a bit risky for government to change housing policy, because government derives income from housing. It's a bit risky for a tycoon to want to engage in reform and competition, because they may lose their kind of the engine of their business. And it's even risky for the poor person in the slum to move and leave to a better housing, because all their friends and family live around them in that slum. So whatever solutions one might create for an issue like housing, you have to engage with this issue of risk and create a venture that somehow combines all of this risk. Doesn't just deal with the local issue, employment or whatever, but starts to change the mindset and the attitudes of all the key decision makers involved so that they behave differently. And I don't know what the solution for housing is in Hong Kong, and I'm sure you know more than I do, but I think perhaps understanding risk is part of it. Immigration is the same thing, or even milk. Why do I buy milk powder in another country? Because I'm afraid of the milk from where I come from. There's risk for my baby. So how do we certify the milk and create branding? I mean, it's a big challenge. It's bigger than dealing with people coming here to buy milk, but ultimately it's about risk. I think you get the point. And in fact, in the UK government, we have a nudge unit which focuses on risk, basically, and trying to save money and improve government through affecting risk. But it's only doing it through government, right? It's not saying we can do it across these different sectors, which is where I think social venturing can help. So you can apply this process to a lot of different activities. In order to support it, we need to therefore first understand the problems, and then we need to understand how the venture can be created to address these different risks behind our chronic social problems. Let's do a bit of dissection. So now we're looking at the anatomy of a social venture. We're staring at the guts of this antivirus that I talked about. And it has a number of components. I think some of this may be familiar to different practitioners. But every social venture that I've been involved with has all of these components. First of all, you have the idea, right? You have a sense that somehow tycoons are facing difficult risk choices, the government is, and so are people who live in houses. So you have an idea to somehow connect all of those together in a reproducible, scalable way. And that's your idea. And you need to design the venture to do that. And over time, organizations develop. In the UK, one of them is called the Charity Partnership. Here, maybe you've got SVHK or others. And they are specifically set up to design these ideas and to trial them, if you like. It's like medical trials, right? You're trialing the new idea. And then you have to find people when you start to scale. You have to identify, and I spent a lot of time poaching people from McKinsey, from the civil service, from the charitable sector, from everywhere, any talent I could find, and getting them to write the report, write the plan for the pilot, do the pilot, and then convince them to leave their jobs finally and actually run the organization. And so you need people. And over time, you have organizations I call them social talent intermediaries, who specialize in attracting talent from those sectors to get them to work in these social ventures. Because they have to be run by someone, right? And generally, if you're going to scale, if you're going to double and triple in size in a few years, you need really talented people to work with you. And then finally, you also need money. Initially, you don't need that much. You maybe need £50,000 or 500,000 Hong Kong dollars. But when you get to the pilot stage, you generally need about $1 million or more. And then when you get to really large, it can be billions or hundreds of millions. The key thing is that you've got to get it in the right order. So many people think that you start with money first, and then maybe people will come. You start with money first, and maybe ideas will come, right? Or many people think that if you just back the people, they may have hopefully good ideas, and maybe they'll bring money, or maybe we'll give them money, if we find the right person. I believe in ideas, people, money. Why? It's because the people and the money, if you have the ideas, match exactly. If you have an idea, you can then find a person, you can find money. Whereas if you have a pool of money, there's no guarantee you have enough ideas or people to use up all your money. And then what you're left with is a large amount of money that doesn't do much. Or worse, you give a few number of people a lot of money, but do they have the idea that works, that can scale within 3 years to solve the problem? Not sure. And if you do too much of that, then people lose confidence in the whole process, and they stop believing in the treatment, and they go to another hospital or whatever, right? So I really believe in ideas, people, money, and I believe that if we want to support innovation, we need to understand how this process works. Patrick has added another one, execution. You then there's a whole set of learning about how you do that, and a lot of it is familiar to those who work in business or venture capital, to go from the need to the solution. What we need to speed up this process is we need more social venture intermediaries in each jurisdiction. We need more social talent intermediaries, and we need more social finance intermediaries to get the ideas, the people, and the money, and support the development of these antiviruses just in time. It's a just-in-time process. Right now in the UK, I have to be perfectly honest with you, we have too much money, and we have too many SVIs. We have the big society bank. $1 billion. I said to the government, I'm not in government now, so I can speak more openly. I said to the government, if you create this $1 billion fund, you're going to have a big problem. Because we don't have enough ideas. We have lots of charities, we have lots of social enterprises. But if you give $100 million to this social enterprise, it will fail. Because it's not ready to scale. It's not ready to increase in size by 300% in 2 years. It will just fall flat. It doesn't have enough people of the right caliber and expertise. It doesn't even know what to do with the money. It can't even report back to you on the money that it spent, and to investors who now want their money back, some of their money back. So I said to them, really get behind the social talent and the social venture intermediaries. Support those organizations, grow that market, because there's not enough capacity. Shaftesbury Partnership, we had to do all 3 of these at the same time. We had to, Patrick and I would have the idea, then I'd go out to McKinsey and I'd take the person, and then after that I'd go into some rich person and I would ask them for the donation. It's very exhausting, so we could only do 2 of these a year, right? Now, in a world in which you might have 1,000 diseases and you can only create 2 antiviruses a year, you're not going to do much, even if each one becomes really big. So you have to create a kind of pharmaceutical industry, and you have to seed that industry with specialists who, over time, learn from each other. If you have enough SVIs, STIs, SFIs, instead of having one hospital that's trying to do everything and deciding which patients should die and which patients should live, you have 10 hospitals and a teaching hospital. And you start to have medical clinicians of different specialities working together. And you start to, and they could be embedded in business, they could be embedded in government, they can be embedded in the voluntary sector, and they're working collaboratively together. So this is really one step, is how do we understand this process and develop the kind of specialists who know how to develop this quite specific sort of knowledge and expertise, and then put into practice. If you want to know more about how you develop this intermediary sector, I was a co-author of a report that the Cabinet Office produced called the Social Investment Market Strategy. Nesta also has a lot of reports on this. And we tried to map all of the different players that can help support this process. Over time, initially in the first years, you just have 1 or 2 players doing all of this. And eventually you specialize. Different players specialize in ideas, some people, some money, and draw in the others to help them. Some specialize in execution now. And then you also then have the other aspects, the specialists in accounting, specialists in governance, specialists in design. And eventually you get a kind of very mature innovation industry. And that's the kind of thing we want to cultivate. But you do have to prime it, and you do have to support and develop it in its early years. Wouldn't it be great if Hong Kong became the center in the world for high-end social innovation, became the place to go from all around the world, just as many come from all around the world to learn about Hong Kong's health system? You know, if we could have that here, that would be amazing. But then there are also things that you can do to support social venturing in policy terms, and none of this is rocket science. What if we could incubate more incubators? So we now have, you know, I think in Hong Kong you maybe have 2 or 3 or 4 incubators. You probably need 10 or 15. In the UK we have 3 or 4. We probably need about 50. The UK has just launched a fund, finally, after I've told them to do it at the beginning, specifically designed to fund incubators. Incubators need about 3 to 7 years before they can be self-sustaining. Often it's a property play. So you make money off supporting the new startups who then pay you to rent the space, and then through that way they become self-sustaining. You know, and property is in huge demand here. And then through that incubator you provide the support that's needed. Secondly, you could train more social ventures. We're training social entrepreneurs. That's great. That's like training nurses. You know, really good people, really. But you also need clinicians. You need people who understand how to make antiviruses. And that's another kind of training. That's a very specialist kind of training. And then you need to stimulate social finance. And we've been doing a lot of that in the UK, and Jeff will talk about that in a minute, so I'm not going to go into that. But kind of make it easier for specialists to evolve who specialize in giving out finance in different ways. But what you can also do at a system level, and we started to do this in the UK, is to release data and control. How can I analyze the disease if you don't give me the information about the disease? So can I have more information about housing in Hong Kong? Can I have more information about who's doing what? You know, really granular data. Then I can analyze it, and then I can come up with some solutions and do focus groups and so on. Secondly, we could train social reformers. Not just social entrepreneurs who know about how to create the social venture in a way that tackles the complex problem, but people who, like social reformers, who can support the social entrepreneurs or social venturers at a systemic level and knit them together with the money and the ideas and the people and so on. And then thirdly, support social angels. When it comes to money, there's never a problem with getting money when you need $1 million, if your idea is good and your people are good. The real problem is getting your first 50,000 US dollars. There's no economic model that does it. There's no fund that's economical in giving out $50,000, because normally a fund needs to be big, so you can pay the salaries of the fund managers. And of course, if you're big, you need to put out money in big chunks, right? It doesn't work. So you need angels. Angels are philanthropists. I met yesterday with a group of technology angels, and I said to them, no offense, but you're philanthropists. At no time in history, except for in California between 1985 and maybe 1995, did you make money as an industry in terms of probability. What you do for the love of it, because we want to help start new things. So that's what we need as well. And we can support them, perhaps by matching the capital that they put in to early stage ventures, perhaps through tax breaks. In the UK, we're exploring that as well. And there's more detail that can be given on this in due course. So one big thing I think could be useful for Hong Kong. There are, I'm sure, many young people, talented young people in our businesses, in our government, who, like me, were just going to carry on and become a partner, become a business leader or a permanent secretary, one day the CE. If you gave them an offer to spend 2 or 3 years to do social venturing and said to them, but you can come back, no problem, you can come back, you might create a few more NatWays, right? Because that's what started me on the journey. It wasn't because I suddenly fell in love with helping the poor or, you know, it was because somebody gave me a no-risk offer to embark on becoming a social reformer, a social venturer. If you can offer that to your young people, your talented young people, and if you can engage the children of the tycoons, maybe you can create a critical mass of social reformers and social venturers to kickstart your pharmaceutical health industry in that respect. So even if you do all these things, there remain a number of challenges, and I'm talking to Carrie now, painfully from my experience. There are 3 issues that time and time again come up when you try and engage with social innovation. Because social innovation is a very specialist area. It's not business as usual. You still have to, as a leader, deal with your business or government, or you still have to run that. But on the side, you have this crazy activity going on. You know, it's like running a secret laboratory alongside business as usual. And sometimes people don't know what's going on in here. They think you're developing some kind of nuclear bomb or something that might threaten their day-to-day work. And in truth, it might. You know, Spotify destroyed EMI. EMI did not want to engage with you know, this new technology because they were worried it would replace their business model, and it did. But the problem is, if you do not engage eventually with that new model, it will happen to you. You cannot escape it because there's all kinds of forces making it happen. So there's three things that I think are very important. And one of the things, in addition to trying to see if the SP model can proliferate, and we can encourage more of these incubators all around the world, that we're trying to now, and particularly with Jeff, and I'll let him speak about it, to encourage, is the development of training to enable more people to experience what it's like to be a social reformer. We think that it's possible now in the 21st century, it's the right time to encourage business people, government, civil servants and leaders, and people in the social sector to not just see themselves as a civil servant or a business leader or a charity worker, but to see themselves as a social reformer and start to learn the theory, the science. There is actually a science to this. We call it econophysics and other things in our team. It's actually thermodynamic processes. I won't go into the detail of that, but practice, how do you incubate and grow to national, international scale these things, and values. It's a Hippocratic oath doing this. There are all kinds of things that happen. You might not have that much money when you do it. You might have to lend money to people who are starting to do it. The media might attack you. Your family, you might have pressure because it's hard work. You might have CEOs of charities that you set up turn around and say they never knew you because they want to be seen to be independent. It's very, very painful developing this kind of antivirus work. It's a sacrifice. And so we find we need to train people in ethics, how to be honest, how to respect the commons, how to look after themselves, look after their own income and their families. Because it's not easy doing this. If you just run into it without any knowledge, you can get crushed, whether in government, business, or voluntary, or as outside of all of that, independently. And what we need to do is to train people, whether across all these sectors, to help explain the change. Are you developing a nuclear bomb, or are you developing an antivirus? Oh, we're developing an antivirus. It will help. It will heal. People need to know what's going on. And we need to cultivate system skills. If middle managers in business or the civil service or in the voluntary sector do not know about this, the typical processes that we use do not work well with innovation. They can crush innovation. For example, one practice in government is we like to press release a new innovation. Two people have come up with an amazing idea to solve the housing crisis in Hong Kong, and then the next day we go, we have found a solution. These two people are going to do it. But they have no office, they have no money, they have no support, and the next day, 2 years later, it's no surprise that they're crushed, and they never want to do it again. So even in government, we have to be careful. Let it incubate first. When is the right time? How do we support it? How do we cultivate? How do we get our people to understand how this works? And then finally, ensure fairness. We have a program in the UK around welfare to work. And I'm a little, to be honest, disappointed with the early results so far. Hopefully it will change. Because we did the change so fast. It's like we created Russia. We created a kind of deliberalized so quickly and invited all these players to come in. And we wanted the charity sector to get involved in delivering work opportunities. But none of the charities are able to scale to absorb £1 billion of welfare to work funding. So who does the money go to? It goes to the private sector or the former government sector. And the charities stay small. Or the charities supply the private sector and the government sector and don't get to actually shape the sector and the industry. So I could go on about this, but the key thing is I think we now need some training, and Jeff and I are working on seeing if we can create a center that could train people in understanding social innovation, social reform across different sectors, and create the kind of new medical laboratory workers of the 21st century looking at social problems from across different sectors. So to finalize, there's lots I think we can learn together. There are real opportunities to learn about how social problems, complex social problems work today. I'm looking forward to seeing how we can partner together. I'm looking forward to seeing how SP can perhaps support and play a role here in the whole work around incubation? Could businesses incubate social ventures? Could government, could voluntary sector incubate? Could we all work together to incubate more social ventures? By doing this, I hope that we can find a way to bring ourselves closer to people, to remove this distance between government and business and citizens, and actually create the connectivity, that can actually, once you bring people together through social ventures, I feel you can often solve problems. And you move away from just protest and war, possible war and riots, to reform, and people working together to come up with solutions and not just always talking about problems. I will close with some provocative thoughts, finally. I think that the really interesting questions now for social reform and social innovation are particularly in three areas. One is poverty and inequality. And many of our countries now in the developed world, we don't have a poverty issue, we have a wealth issue. The issue is not that we're not doing enough for the poor, it's that we're not helping the rich to understand their responsibility towards the poor. So any venture which gets rich alongside poor and creates a bond between them, I think has more chance of success in dealing with inequality. And Patrick can talk about The Challenge. It's a charity we developed that is doing that in a very exciting way. Secondly, asset ownership. The poor are poor not because they don't have enough wages, that is true, or they don't have enough public services. The poor are poor is because they don't own enough stuff, either through education, which gives them some assets that they can then sell, they're selling themselves to the world, or they don't own enough, financial assets like a house or art, or they don't crucially, they don't own enough business assets, right? So if you give somebody a living wage, if you give somebody a good education, if you give them, good public services, the problem they still have is they don't own the property company, or they don't own Facebook. They don't even, and what they did in the early years in California through the employee ownership schemes is they did that. They created millions of millionaires. And those millionaires many of them became philanthropists, and they helped their neighborhood. Today, we create a few billionaires in our society. And so I'm excited, and the opposition in the UK is looking at models like, how do you incentivize wider share ownership? For example, could you reduce corporation tax for companies that could prove that they even give their cleaners shares, right? Which will create the next generation of entrepreneurs. Could you, maybe this is too controversial to say here, but could you offer some of the property tycoons here, we might introduce a land value tax, but you can have a complete rebate on that land value tax if you have wider share ownership in your property company. Don't know, maybe too controversial. But, and of course, we all know, as policymakers, things like land value tax are probably the most efficient way to tax. The third area I think that's exciting is media reform, because of social media and so on. If you look at the early days of newspapers, they're actually reform organs, right? Abolition, factory work. Most of the newspapers in the UK, I don't know about the South China Morning Post, but their heritage is in campaigning for social reform. They worked with the medical professionals in social reform of the Victorian era. Today, their business model, the 20th century model, which is a commercial model, doesn't work anymore because of the internet and social media. So we're having to see how they rediscover their historic mission to take a view on what needs to change and help to make it happen, not to criticize with no productivity, but to actually make social change happen positively. And they're starting to see that in the UK now. So the Evening Standard, the Telegraph, are starting to have campaigns. The Evening Standard had a poverty drive, which has really helped many, many thousands of young youth, poor youth in London. And I wonder if our exciting Hong Kong media and newspapers, there is an opportunity for them to do the same, to focus on what are the solutions and how can we mobilize the public to get behind the solutions, to engage that citizen sector, because without engaging the citizen sector as well in the solutions, they just remain something that the elite do in impact venture philanthropy conferences and, with these big foundations, rather than something that we do with the people. So I will leave you with that complex but interesting set of thoughts, hopefully, and remind you that whatever you do here will benefit the world because of your strategic positioning. Hong Kong, once again, in the center of things, able to innovate for the 21st century. And I and my team and those I know, we're excited to work with you and help make that a reality. Thank you very much.